In this video, I'll show you how to make a thriving planted aquarium for one of the most beautiful creatures in the aquarium hobby. Obviously, I'm talking about a Siamese fighting fish, more commonly known as a Betta fish. Let's waste no time and get straight into the build. I'll be using this rimless glass aquarium and I'll put all the measurements up on screen now. The first thing that I want to do is make an adjustment to the glass tank. I'm going to use a sheet of acrylic to create a separate compartment where the filtration will take place. This will not only result in better filtration, but it will also mean I can hide equipment like the heater from the main part of the tank. I've taken some measurements of the internal dimensions of the tank and now I'm cutting the acrylic down so it fits inside. Ignore the grey colour as that's just the protective coating that I can peel off later. Now it's time to attach the piece that will separate the filter media from the filter. I'm using some sandpaper to scratch up the acrylic where I'm going to attach the barrier. This will help the glue hold much better. With a line of super glue in place, I can now carefully place on the barrier. One thing to note is that they're going to be locked together in just a second or two, so make sure you take your time to get it in the right place before attaching it. At the bottom, I'm attaching this small piece of egg crate which will allow the water to freely pass through whilst holding back the filter media. As I'm sure you can see, I've drilled out a square on the left which is where the water will flow in, and the hole on the right is where the water will be pushed back out by the pump. I've removed the protective coating from the acrylic so it can now be installed inside the aquarium. I'm applying a bead of silicone along the back and bottom before pressing it in place inside the tank. I'll use some more silicone to seal up the edges before leaving it to dry for 24 hours. It's the next day and I think it's turned out really well. Before moving on, let me quickly explain how it works and why it's beneficial. The water will overflow from the main part of the tank through this square and into this first section. This is where all the mechanical and biological filtration will be, and as you can see there's a lot of space for it. The water will then flow through the egg crate at the bottom into this section where a pump will push it back into the tank. Other equipment like a heater can also be placed in this second section. This means that no equipment will be visible inside the tank, and I think that looks much more natural than having something like a filter or heater blocking the view. Now let's move on to the lighting. The light for this build was kindly sent to me by Chihiro's. This is their C2 RGB LED light. There's a bracket that mounts it on the side of the tank and that makes it super easy to raise or lower depending on your preference. The light intensity and timer can all be controlled through an app, which is always super handy. This tank's going to sit on my desk where it's visible from the front and side angles, so I need to take that into account for the hardscape. I found this stunning piece of driftwood in my local fish shop and I think it has the potential to look really good inside this scape. Just like always, I'm taking some time to experiment with multiple different layouts, but this is slightly more difficult than normal as I need to make it look good from not one but two sides. Some of the branches are pushing right up on the glass, so I'm breaking them off to give it a better fit. I quite like how it sits here, but it definitely needs to be elevated, so let's add some substrate. For this aquarium, I'm going to use Tropica Aquasoil. I'm using my hand to slope the substrate up to the back right corner as this is going to help create some depth. With that done, I can place the driftwood back inside and add even more detail with some rocks. These are Cereus stones. I think their light colour will contrast the dark wood and substrate really well. I'm trying not to overdo it with the stones as I want to leave plenty of room for the plants. I'm pouring in some more aquasoil towards the back to build some more height, followed by a few more stones to add some more detail. I'm really happy with how the hardscape's looking so far, but there's a few things that need to be done before I can start planting. Once I fill the tank up with water, the wood is definitely going to float, which would destroy all the hard work that I've put into it. An easy solution to this is to use the super glue and tissue method to lock the wood to the rocks. All I'm doing is wedging in some tissue between the Cereus stone and wood and then soaking it in some liquid type super glue. It dries really quickly and it's 100% shrimp and fish safe. It's even strong enough to be pulled out as one entire piece, but I do like to add a few more contact points just to make sure that it holds up for the long term. As this aquarium is for a Betta fish, it's going to need a lid, so these branches out the top need to be trimmed down. I think the easiest way to do this is going to be completely removing the hardscape and then using some pliers to break down the branches. By using pliers instead of something like a saw, it will create a more natural break instead of a clean cut. After a bit of work, all the branches are sitting just below the top of the tank, which will allow a lid to sit nicely on top. I'm adding some more aqua soil in the back to build some more height, followed by adding a few more cereal stones for some more detail. I love how this hardscape's turned out, and I think it looks great from not only the front but also the side as well. Before adding any plants, I'm going to give the entire tank a really good spray down. I want a carpeting plant that stretches all the way from the foreground in the front to the foreground in the side. I think a great plant for this would be Monte Carlo. It's super easy to grow and will form a dense carpet in no time at all. I've split a couple pots up into lots of smaller chunks and they can now be planted inside the aquarium. I like to use the tweezers to plant them nice and deep inside the aqua soil, as this stops them from floating up once the tank's filled up. To add some nice variety to the small round leaves of the Monte Carlo, I'm going to plant in some of this Crypt Parva. Its leaves stay extremely small and I think it'll add some nice detail at the base of the hardscape throughout the tank. Sticking with crypts, I've got another species that I think will look great inside this aquarium. I've never used this one before, so I'm excited to see how it looks after it starts to establish. I've split it into two chunks, planting the larger one on the right with a smaller one in this gap behind the cereal stone. I'm going to go ahead and plant a few more species of crypts in the mid-ground areas throughout the tank. Now let's move on to planting the background, as it's looking quite empty. This here is a species of Rotala that has some really nice fine detailed leaves. I've never used this plant before, so I'm not completely sure how it's going to grow, so I guess I'll just have to wait and find out. The stems should grow right to the surface of the water and get more colourful as they do so. I'm liking the planting so far, but there's definitely a few more species that I want to add before filling the tank up with water. A light spray down every now and then helps keep the plants nice and hydrated and stops them from drying out. This is Trident Fern, and I think it will look really good growing amongst the tall branches of the driftwood. It's an epiphyte, so I haven't got to plant it in the substrate and I can simply wedge it in gaps between the wood. Next to go in is some Bucephalandra and Anubias. These are slow growing epiphytic plants that will add some really nice detail to the aquarium. I've cleaned off all the rock wool so they can now be planted throughout the scape. In some areas there's no gaps that I can wedge them into, so I'm using a small amount of super glue to mount them in place. I'm mainly planting them around the driftwood, as that's where I think they look most natural. I'm really liking the planting so far, but I think it can look even better with a couple additions. I'll quickly show you how to make these mossy stones that you can freely place throughout the scape. You'll need some small pieces of rock, it doesn't matter what kind they are as they'll be covered up anyway. Some thread and then some moss or liverwort that you want to use. I'm using Riccardia, which is a species of liverwort. I'm tying the thread around the rock and then placing some Riccardia on top. I can then wrap the thread around to lock it down, tie it off and then cut off the excess. These mossy rocks are really quite simple to make, and in my opinion I prefer it to the glue. They're super easy to place inside and you can either move them or take them out completely if you ever wanted to. Before I can fill the tank up with water, I need to get the filtration sorted. As I mentioned at the start, the water will flow through this first section, down through the egg crate into the second section where it will be pushed back into the tank. In the first section, I'll start by adding some ceramic rings which will do the bulk of the work in terms of biological filtration. On top of that, I'm adding some filter foam followed by some fine filter floss which will help polish the water and keep it crystal clear. This is the pump that will push the water from the second chamber back into the aquarium. It's a small USB pump that's even adjustable, which is always handy. I've built this output tube that attaches to the pump with some tubing and push fittings. The end lines up perfectly with the hole that leads back into the tank. I've then created this output nozzle from an acrylic drinking straw that goes into the push fitting. I created the shape by heating it up and using the back of a Sharpie to open up the end. I think this output will work really well as it can easily be removed whenever I need to clean the pump. Although it probably is a bit overkill, I think this filtration system will work really well for this tank. Now I think it's time to fill the aquarium up with water. The bubble wrap helps disperse the water and stops it from disrupting the aquasoil, which would likely uproot the plants. The water is nothing special and it's just dechlorinated tap water. Now that the tank is filled up, I can turn on the pump and see how everything works. Everything's working really well, and the bonus of the overflow filtration is that it also skims the surface and keeps it nice and clean. Before I can leave the tank to grow in, I need to set the light up properly. I'll have it on 50% power to start with and set the timer up so it's on for 6 hours a day. I'll slowly increase the intensity week by week until it's close to 100%. Doing this gradually helps reduce algae at the start. I'll place the CO2 diffuser in the back part of the tank where the small bubbles can be sucked up by the filter and blown into the tank. CO2 certainly isn't essential, but it will help with the plant growth. Now that the aquarium's all set up, all that's left to do is to leave it to grow in and establish. After 4 months of growth, this aquarium is completely transformed and I'm really happy with how it looks. With that said, it hasn't been the smoothest journey and there has been a couple battles with algae. It was mainly growing throughout the Monte Carlo carpet and on the stems in the background. I'm glad to say it's mostly cleared up, but there is a few patches here and there if you look closely. At the moment, the only inhabitants are a few Amano shrimp, but I really can't wait to introduce the Betta fish. As you may have noticed, I have added a white background to the tank. I think it makes the green plants pop much better and I think it frames the aquarium in really well. As for other changes, I've added some small black strips to create a grid on the overflow section to stop any creatures from being sucked in. The filter box is still working great, but I do need to make an addition. I'm adding a heater which will help keep the water at a stable temperature of 24 degrees. This is a must if you plan on keeping a Betta fish. They're also known for jumping out of aquariums, so I'm placing on a lid to ensure this never happens. Each corner has a small pad of silicone which will help stop the glass from sliding around on the top of the tank. I'll leave the tank for a day or so to get to the proper temperature before introducing the Betta fish. A few days have passed and the tank is now home to a stunning male Betta fish. I really love his blue coloration and I think it pops out against the green plants really well. He's certainly not shy and loves to explore the tank and swim amongst the plants. I'm definitely going to need help with a name, so be sure to drop your suggestions in the comments below. As I mentioned at the start, this tank will be sitting on my desk, so it's going to be great to have some company whilst I'm editing videos. Despite the battles with algae, I'm really happy with how this tank's turned out and I think it looks really clean without any equipment visible inside the tank. Once again, be sure to drop your name suggestions in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.